In a quiet Virginia cemetery, a small gravestone once bore the name Charles Lee Charlette, a name given by strangers to a boy no one could identify. In June 1972, the body of an approximately 4-year-old was discovered under a bridge, and for 53 years he remained known only as a John Doe. It took 5 decades, determined detectives, and cutting-edge DNA science to finally discover the boy's real name and the likely dark truth of what happened to him. It also turned out that uncovering this John Doe's identity would uncover yet another crime just as depraved as this one. And fair warning, while I don't include any graphic descriptions or anything in here, this is one of the most deeply disturbing cases I've ever covered. On June 13, 1972, a passerby discovered the body of a young boy in Massey Creek, beneath the old Colchester Road Bridge in Lorton, Virginia. Police determined that he had perished from intentional blunt force trauma to the head. No one came forward to identify the boy, and investigators found no missing person reports that matched his description. The absence of any missing child report for a boy of that age was a grim sign, as it suggested that whoever knew the truth was likely a family member or guardian. With no leads to follow, the case quickly went cold. With initial breakthroughs in genetic testing in the 90s, the preserved DNA samples from the young John Doe proved insufficient to create a full genetic profile. In 2021, cutting-edge DNA techniques finally provided the big break. Experts at a private lab, Astrea Forensics, managed to extract a viable genetic profile from just a few millimeters of the boy's preserved hair. This was far less than what earlier methods required, and a complete DNA profile was obtained. With this powerful DNA profile in hand, investigators turned to another new technique, forensic genetic genealogy, the method of tracing family trees using DNA matches. Forensic genealogists used the unknown boy's DNA to search databases and soon found relatives that pointed toward a family in Philadelphia. Detectives working with Philadelphia police identified a woman from that family. This connection ultimately led them to the boy's mother, Vera Bryant. She was from Philadelphia and had passed away around 1980 of unknown causes. Her relatives recalled that she had 2 young sons in the early 1970s. Family members told police the story as best they could remember. In 1972, Vera Bryant and her boyfriend, James Hedgepeth, had taken a trip from Philadelphia to Virginia with her 2 little boys. These were 4-year-old Carl and 6-month-old James Jr. When the couple returned from that trip, the children weren't with them. Vera claimed the boys were staying with Hedgepeth's relatives in Virginia, and she never reported her sons missing. No one in the family saw Carl or the baby again, and in a weird turn of events, everyone seems to have been cool with this and simply moved on. Regardless of how odd this is, this family account was the puzzle piece investigators needed to make sense of the cold case. To be absolutely certain they had the right person, detectives sought definitive DNA proof. In 2023, Fairfax County investigators exhumed Vera Bryant's remains from a Philadelphia cemetery to compare her DNA with the unidentified boy's DNA. The testing took some time due to the condition of the old remains, but by mid-2025 the results were in. Vera was the biological mother of the boy. At long last, the child in the creek had a real name. He was Carl Matthew Bryant, a child who was cruelly taken when he was just 4 years old. With Carl's identity known, the focus shifted to what happened and who was responsible. Investigators now believe that Carl was eliminated by his own mother and her boyfriend during that fateful 1972 trip. In light of the family's statements and other evidence, police suspect that Vera Bryant and James Hedgepeth inflicted the trauma and left Carl's body in the Virginia Creek. Disturbingly, they also believe that baby James, who was only an infant, likely also met a similar fate around the same time, since he never reappeared either. The exact events of that trip may never be fully known, but it's now clear that both children met a tragic end. Hedgepeth, who had a prior conviction for taking someone's life, undoubtedly raised red flags for investigators in retrospect. However, neither he nor Vera can be brought to justice, as they had both perished decades ago. What remains is an effort to find any trace of little James Jr. Fairfax County authorities have asked other agencies and the public to be on the lookout for any unidentified remains from the 1970s that might actually be young James. They suspect his remains could have been left somewhere along the route between Philadelphia and Middlesex County, Virginia, which is the route the couple traveled in 1972. There are no words that can soften the blow of the story of these innocent kids, but the horror of what happened is compounded by the silence that followed. Their own family failed them by never reporting them missing, by never demanding answers, and by never following up when they vanished. That absence of action left Carl nameless in a grave for over 5 decades, robbed of justice and recognition, and ultimately let the perpetrators escape from justice. It's a failure so profound it defies understanding, since it's essentially an additional betrayal on top of the ultimate betrayal the children experienced at the hands of Bryant and Hedgepeth. In December 1980, hunters in a Florida forest stumbled upon a shallow grave, unaware they had just uncovered the tragic conclusion to a family mystery. Bones lay scattered in the underbrush, disturbed by wildlife, and for decades the victim's identity remained unknown. Meanwhile, a family in Texas was left with agonizing questions after their daughter Carol Skidmore vanished during a 1977 road trip. Now nearly half a century later, modern DNA technology and detective work have finally given Carol's story a potentially solved ending. Carol Skidmore was a 26-year-old wife and mother from Sealy, Texas. On March 29, 1977, she set off on an interstate trip with her husband, James Skidmore, and her 5-year-old son, Lynn Dale Mahaffey. The couple hoped the journey to visit James's parents in Rossville, Georgia, would help mend their troubled 1-year marriage. Carol's family grew concerned when weeks passed with only one brief phone call. On April 9, 1977, Carol told her parents she wasn't sure when they'd be back, a sign that all was not well. That was the last time anyone heard her voice and confirmed that she was alive. What followed was a string of grim discoveries spanning multiple states. In May 1977, the body of a young boy was found floating in Parksville Lake, Tennessee. He was wrapped in plastic and weighed down with heavy rock, indicating obvious signs of a deliberate drowning. Investigators suspected it might be Carol's son, Lynn, and sadly, the FBI confirmed the boy's identity in June 1977. Just as that confirmation came, another shock. On June 1st, 1977, James Skidmore was found deceased in a motel room in Harrison, Arkansas. Based on the evidence, it was determined that he was responsible for that specific act, and he left behind a note talking about his regrets in general terms. With James deceased and Lynn's slaying now evident, investigators launched a desperate search for Carol, but she was nowhere to be found. For a time, Carol Skidmore became a missing person case, her fate a haunting question mark for her loved ones and law enforcement alike. Unbeknownst to Carol's family, the answer to her disappearance had already been unearthed by chance 3 years after she vanished. In December 1980, 3 hunters trekking through woods near Fountain in Florida came across human skeletal remains in a shallow grave. The remains had been there long enough that animals had disturbed the site, scattering some of the bones around the forest floor. Investigators with the Bay County Sheriff's Office were called in, and noted signs of foul play, including damage to the clothing found with the skeleton. The body was sent for forensic examination, and she was ruled out as being a number of local missing women. For the next 45 years, the two cases, Carol's 1977 disappearance and the unidentified remains found in 1980, lingered in limbo. Carol was officially listed as a missing person in Georgia and Texas, and her family held out hope for answers. Over the years, relatives provided DNA samples to databases, praying for a match if her body was ever found. In Florida, detectives periodically revisited the Jane Doe file from Bay County, but with the forensic technology of the 20th century, there was little they could do. The cases of Carol Skidmore and the nameless remains in Fountain existed in parallel, but it would take leaps in forensic science to prove any connection between the two. In 2023, the Cold Case Unit took a fresh look at the Fountain Jane Doe. The remains were exhumed, and a crucial piece of evidence, one of the victim's teeth, was submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for DNA testing. Extracting DNA from a decades-old tooth was challenging, but the lab successfully developed a DNA profile unique to the unknown woman. This profile was then uploaded to the CODIS system, a national database of DNA profiles, and the breakthrough came almost immediately. Two individuals in Texas had genetic markers in common with the mystery woman. These two people turned out to be siblings who, years earlier, had volunteered their biological data in hopes of finding their missing sister. That sister was Carol Skidmore, who had vanished in 1977. With the identity confirmed, investigators could finally piece together the full story of what happened to Carol. The evidence now painted a tragic picture consistent with what detectives long suspected. Carol had been slain back in 1977, likely at the hands of her own husband. Bay County Sheriff's officials believe James Skidmore eliminated his wife and then buried her body in that shallow grave in Florida. At some point, he also did the same to little Lynn, dumping his weighted-down body in a Tennessee lake before James himself perished in that motel room. At present, this theory remains all but confirmed, though police are still attempting to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and determine if others were involved. Hey everyone, Jimmy here as usual with a big shout out to all subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Now let's get back to business. One spring morning in 2021, Cassie Sheets, a young West Virginia mother of 3, set out on a hike with 2 friends in the Spruce Knob area of Monongahela National Forest. Spruce Knob, the state's highest peak, is known for its remote, winding trails, and the trio hoped for adventure. But by the next day, Cassie's 2 hiking companions had emerged from the forest alone, and Cassie had vanished without a trace. Cassie's trip on March 11, 2021, was unusual from the start. According to her mother, Cassie wasn't an avid hiker and rarely visited Spruce Knob. Yet that day, she accompanied 2 male friends, one of them an ex-boyfriend, into the mountains, reportedly to show them something in the area. Not long after the hike began, all 3 individuals were reported missing when they failed to return as expected. By the morning of March 12th, searchers located the 2 men, but Cassie was nowhere to be found. One friend was discovered waiting by a vehicle, and the other wandered out of the woods, cold and tired. They told authorities a perplexing story. The group had become separated after hearing a mysterious noise in the woods, during which one of the men fell or was injured. In the confusion of that moment, Cassie allegedly went missing. Her mother found the men's story implausible. She knew Cassie would never wander off alone, especially since Cassie was afraid of the dark. In the days after Cassie vanished, authorities scoured the Spruce Knob area with helicopters, cadaver dogs, and ground teams, but found no trace of her. The search concentrated near the trails where she was last seen, yet no footprints, clothing, or other clues turned up. Meanwhile, Cassie's family and local volunteers organized their own searches in the unforgiving terrain, refusing to give up as weeks turned into months. They combed woods and hollows beyond the official search zone, hoping for any hint of Cassie, but every effort met with heartbreak, and not a single piece of evidence was ever found. 9 months after Cassie disappeared, a grim discovery finally brought a measure of closure. On December 29, 2021, a pair of hunters trekking through a remote section of the Monongahela National Forest stumbled upon skeletal human remains. The remains were found deep in the northern Seneca Creek area, an isolated wilderness some distance from the original search zone. Investigators noted that the scene was undisturbed. The bones lay on the ground, not buried or concealed in any way. Scattered nearby were personal items that seemed eerily familiar, articles of clothing matching what Cassie was last seen wearing, and a set of keys believed to be hers. Based on these items, authorities strongly suspected the remains belonged to Cassie Sheets, though official confirmation would require forensic analysis. The discovery site also raised significant new questions. It lay roughly 8 miles away from the area near Spruce Knob that police had initially scoured, and she was a novice hiker. The terrain in between was rugged, with ravines and back roads that would be challenging to traverse on foot. To Cassie's family, it seemed implausible that she simply wandered that distance by accident. This location disparity became a central point of contention between the official investigation and the family's suspicions. Following the recovery of the remains, law enforcement faced the task of determining what happened to Cassie. The West Virginia State Police enlisted a forensic anthropologist to examine the bones for any signs of injury or violence. There were no indications of blunt force trauma or foul play on the remains. In other words, Cassie's skeleton didn't show evidence of an attack or any other form of violence. Without obvious trauma, investigators leaned toward the theory that her passing may have been a tragic accident or due to natural causes like hypothermia. By mid-2024, authorities publicly stated that, pending final DNA confirmation, they intended to close the case with no criminal charges filed. To them, the facts suggested that Cassie likely got lost or injured in the wilderness, and that her two companions, found safe the next day, weren't responsible for her demise. West Virginia's medical examiner's office faced a DNA testing backlog, meaning it took until January 2025 to officially confirm that the bones found belonged to Cassie. With that confirmation, the missing persons case officially became a closed incident involving a deceased individual who had been located. However, despite this official closure, many continue to wonder what actually happened to Cassie at the Monongahela National Forest. For over 30 years, the Arizona desert kept its secret. The identity of a missing 15-year-old girl known only as Apache Junction Jane Doe. In 1992, a man walking his dog stumbled upon the remains of an unidentified young female in a remote area of Apache Junction, Arizona. No one knew her name or how she ended up over 40 miles from home, and her identity remained a mystery for decades. Thanks to a relentless investigation and breakthroughs in DNA technology, she's finally gotten her name back. She's Melody Harrison, a 15-year-old who disappeared from Phoenix in June 1992, but with her identification, yet another mystery still needs to be solved. Melody Harrison was a high-achieving freshman at South Mountain High School in Phoenix. She was well-liked by her peers, and according to them, she wasn't the type to run away, at least not permanently. In June 1992, After an argument with her older sister, Melody left home on foot to cool off and would never be seen again. Her sudden disappearance was deeply concerning to her family. Although she had briefly run off for a couple hours before, she always returned. So when night fell, and Melody still had not returned, her loved ones knew something was wrong. They reported the 15-year-old missing to Phoenix police, who initially dismissed her case as a teenage runaway situation. Over the next few years, various people claimed to have spotted Melody in multiple places, which led her family to believe she might have intentionally started a new life. In 1996, acting on that hope, they even had Melody removed from the missing persons database, convinced she was still alive somewhere. Unbeknownst to them, Melody was already gone, and had been since the summer of 1992. On August 6, 1992, 2 months after Melody vanished, a man discovered human remains in the open desert near the intersection of Idaho Road and Baseline Road in Apache Junction. The body was badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, indicating it had been out in the elements for several weeks at minimum. There were a few clues at the scene, including the victim's clothing and a couple of personal items, including one which would later let her family identify her. She wore a Team Gear t-shirt with soccer ball graphics, cut-off Levi's denim shorts, and a gold ring with a nugget design on her left ring finger. In one pocket, investigators found a Phoenix Transit token inscribed "Valid for one student fare," suggesting the unidentified girl was indeed a student from the Phoenix area. These items hinted at her identity, but at the time no one connected this Jane Doe to Melody. Authorities estimated the Jane Doe to be around 16 to 18 years old, slightly older than Melody's actual age, and no definitive reason for her passing could be determined from the remains. However, despite this finding, foul play was strongly suspected. The remote location and circumstances implied she hadn't perished by accident, and investigators suspected her body had been dumped in the desert. Investigators collected what evidence they could at the scene. Unfortunately, with no name and few leads, the case went cold. For years, the young victim was known only as Apache Junction Jane Doe, and her case file gathered dust while Melody's family held on to their false hope. The turning point came with the improvement in forensic genetic technology. In 2018, the authorities partnered with the nonprofit DNA Doe Project, which specializes in using DNA databases to identify unknown victims. The Jane Doe's DNA was painstakingly analyzed and uploaded to genealogy websites, and volunteer genealogists built out her family tree. Notably, it was found that she had a somewhat uncommon mixed background, with one parent being of African American and German ancestry, with the other being Mexican. And yeah, I realize now that I said that this is uncommon, I'm going to get 10 people in the comments saying that this is their exact background. Notably, gaps in the genealogical database records indicated that one of the young woman's parents had been adopted, complicating the usage of this technique. Finally, by 2023, the DNA Doe Project genealogists pinpointed a potential family for the Apache Junction Jane Doe. A close DNA match, a first cousin, led investigators to Melody's mother and sister in Phoenix, and they were able to quickly confirm her identity because of a ring Melody was wearing. With Melody Harrison's identity solved, attention turned to unraveling how she perished and who might have been involved. Some relatives wondered early on if Melody's boyfriend at the time, whom the family never approved of, could have had something to do with her passing. However, no evidence has surfaced implicating anyone from her personal life. Given that Melody likely perished around the time she went missing in 1992, authorities have also re-examined the broader context of that era. The early 1990s in Phoenix were a dangerous time for young women, with two confirmed serial predators active and preying on targets who were Melody's age. These two perpetrators slew at least 5 women in Phoenix between 1991 and 1993, though the true extent of their deeds isn't fully known. Notably, in 2025, the Arizona Attorney General's office launched a new cold case unit, with Melody's mystery among its first priorities. Today, police are actively seeking the public's help to finally piece together Melody's last days and bring the person responsible to justice. They urge anyone who remembers a girl matching Melody's description in the summer of 1992 to come forward. Even details about her circle of friends or acquaintances back then could prove fundamental to the case. After all these years, investigators stress that no tip is too small, and one tiny thread could unravel the mystery and give Melody Harrison the justice she deserves. It's easy to think of a sea monster as something sudden, a fleeting shape in a blurry photograph, a single terrifying breach of the waves, and then gone. But what happens when one comes to stay and set up a little cute home base in a bustling American harbor? That's exactly what happened in the summer of 1817 in Gloucester, Massachusetts, creating one of the most credible and intensely scrutinized sea monster stories in history. Long before the summer of 1817, whispers of a great serpent already haunted the rocky coast of Cape Ann. The earliest documented account comes from 1638, when the English traveler John Josselyn wrote of a creature seen by both English settlers and local indigenous people. They described a massive snake that coiled up upon the rocks on occasion. Crucially, Josselyn noted that the indigenous guides warned the Englishmen against shooting it, believing that if the beast weren't slain outright, it would attack and endanger all their lives. By 1817, Gloucester was one of America's oldest seaports, a town whose identity was forged on the waves of the North Atlantic. Its citizens were fishermen, mariners, and whalers, experts who could read the water like a book and identify its inhabitants at a glance. Their livelihoods depended on not being fooled by tricks of light or odd-looking waves. This context is what makes the story so compelling. When these men began reporting something they couldn't explain, it carried more weight than a usual tall tale. The first reports in early August 1817 were met with the expected ridicule. The skipper of a vessel reported seeing a 60-foot serpent at the harbor's entrance, an observation that was treated as a joke at the time. But the laughter didn't last long, and on August 10th, the woodpeckers of truth began to peck apart the dam of disbelief. Mariner Amos Story watched the creature from shore for over an hour, noting its head resembled a sea turtle. That same day, another resident saw what she thought was a log on an island, only to watch in shock as it moved on its own. The sightings intensified, and from August 12th to 14th, respected shipmaster Solomon Allen III observed the creature from his boat. He described a head as large as a horse's, a body with up to 50 distinct humps, and an incredible speed, estimating it could travel a mile in under 3 minutes. On August 14th, with crowds of curious onlookers lining the shore, the creature put on a show. The day's most dramatic encounter belonged to Matthew Gaffney, a ship carpenter who got within 30 feet of the animal. He described its head as the size of a keg, and its body as thick as a barrel, moving with a bizarre vertical motion. Gaffney did the natural thing and pulled out his musket and started blasting, but this seemed to have no effect, and the creature resurfaced a safe distance away. By mid-August, sea serpent mania had fully gripped the town. Sightings became a daily event, so common that some residents brought out chairs to watch the spectacle. Newspapers up and down the coast started spreading the tale far and wide. An arriving ship, unwarned of the harbor's new resident, reportedly saw the creature, turned, and fled in terror. The phenomenon didn't end with that summer, and the creature, or one just like it, returned in 1818 and again in 1819, with hundreds more witnessing it off a nearby coast. The sheer volume and duration of the sightings made it impossible to dismiss as a simple mistake. From the dozens of sworn testimonies, a remarkably consistent portrait of the creature emerged. Witnesses consistently placed its length between 60 and 100 feet, with a body as thick as a barrel. The head, often held several feet above the water, was compared to that of a horse, a sea turtle, or a large snake. It was described as dark and smooth, with no visible scales. But the creature's most defining characteristic was its body and motion. It was dark brown or black and appeared to be segmented, like a line of barrels floating in the water. This gave it a lumpy, jointed appearance, and this visual was directly linked to its unique method of propulsion. It moved in a vertical, undulating way that witnesses repeatedly likened to a caterpillar crawling. This detail is particularly significant, as known marine animals generally move with a horizontal side-to-side action. The consistent reporting of a completely different, almost unnatural form of movement suggests that the witnesses were observing a real and singular phenomenon. It moved with astonishing speed, far faster than a whale, but was also seen resting placidly on the surface, seemingly indifferent to the commotion it was causing. The news from Gloucester electrified Boston's intellectual elite, particularly the members of the fledgling Linnaean Society of New England. Formed in 1814, this ambitious group of doctors, lawyers, and other men of learning saw a golden opportunity. In a scientific world completely dominated by Europe, discovering and classifying a creature of this magnitude would be a monumental achievement for American science. Properly classifying this monster, which was entirely unknown to science, would be a massive boost to the new nation's scientific prestige. On August 18, 1817, they formed a committee to launch the first ever formal scientific investigation of a sea serpent. Their approach was impressively methodical. They developed a 25-point questionnaire and enlisted a local justice of the peace to collect sworn legal affidavits from eyewitnesses. They treated the investigation like a court case, believing that the path to scientific truth lay in establishing the credibility of human testimony. Witnesses were questioned separately to prevent their stories from influencing one another, and they were asked about everything from the creature's speed to the existence of gills. Then came the breakthrough they'd been hoping for. On September 27th, a strange 3-foot-long black snake was found and eliminated. Its most peculiar feature was a series of distinct humps along its spine. In the charged atmosphere, the conclusion seemed obvious. It had to be a baby sea serpent. The society, desperate for physical proof, seized upon this discovery. They declared the specimen the progeny of the great serpent and gave the new genus a formal Latin name, Scoliophus atlanticus, the Atlantic humped snake. This very scientific-sounding creature was rushed to market, and for a brief moment, the Linnaean Society were heroes. The carcass of Scoliophus atlanticus was even put on public display in Philadelphia, and it was presented not as a sideshow, but as a legitimate scientific find. America finally had its very own discovery from the natural world that could rival anything European scientists were classifying. But the triumph was short-lived. A trained French naturalist, Alexandre Lesueur, got a look at the specimen. With an expert's eye for comparative anatomy, he saw it not as a new marine marvel, but as something tragically mundane. It was a common eastern racer snake that had been afflicted with spinal deformities caused by tumors. The revelation was a public relations catastrophe, and the Linnaean Society was humiliated, with its scientific credibility shattered overnight. The entire affair was immediately rebranded the Gloucester hoax, and the Society's embarrassing mistake gave skeptics all the ammunition they needed. The Society quietly disbanded in 1822, its name forever tied to this failure. Herein lies the central tragedy of the Gloucester serpent story. The debunking of the deformed snake proved only that the Society had misidentified a land animal. It did absolutely nothing to explain what hundreds of people had witnessed in the harbor for weeks. But the spectacular nature of the scientific error poisoned the well, and the small deformed snake became a wider explanation for why the whole thing was fake. Despite this so-called debunking, curious minds have continued to ask what the serpent was for over 200 years. Early skeptics suggested mistaken identity, ranging from a line of dolphins, a large basking shark, or a pod of seals. Yet the witnesses, most of whom were professional mariners, consistently rejected these explanations. More recently, a far more elegant and scientifically grounded explanation has emerged. This theory reframes the entire event not as a monster hunt, but as an environmental tragedy. The story begins with a global catastrophe, the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which led to 1816's Year Without a Summer. The resulting crop failures and collapse of traditional fisheries in New England forced a massive, desperate shift to different kinds of fishing. This meant the sudden deployment of vast amounts of fishing gear, ropes, nets, and the wooden kegs used as floats, into coastal waters. This theory decodes the mystery with stunning clarity. The bizarre descriptions suddenly make perfect sense. The line of barrels observed wasn't the creature's back. It was literally a line of wooden fishing floats trailing behind it. The strange vertical motion wasn't a biological function. Rather, it was the desperate, unnatural struggling of a large fish, hopelessly entangled in ropes and debris. The head held out of the water could have been the animal's actual head, or a fluke or fin caught up in the gear. Of course, this theory still fails to account for how so many hardy seamen couldn't distinguish barrels from a biological entity. One possible explanation for the Gloucester serpent lies not in biology, but in psychology. The summer of 1817 was a moment of heightened tension, coming just after the Year Without a Summer, when food shortages and economic stress weighed heavily on coastal communities. In such conditions, the sudden appearance of something strange in the harbor could ignite a powerful cycle of suggestion and belief. Once the first credible witness spoke out, others may have unconsciously reinforced the story through their own observations, fitting what they saw into the growing narrative. This is the essence of mass hysteria, shared expectation shaping perception. In Gloucester, the serpent might not have been a monster at all, but a mirror of collective anxiety projected onto the waves. Ultimately, whatever this sea monster was remains an unsolved mystery, and new hypotheses are constantly being produced to try to explain what it actually was. On July 18, 1980, a grisly discovery shattered the peace at a California high school. At Westlake High School in Thousand Oaks, maintenance workers found the body of a young woman dumped near the parking lot. She lay on a dirt slope by the football field, clad in a white t-shirt and red pants, with black high-heeled shoes tossed into the nearby brush. Evidence on the concrete suggested she had been slain elsewhere and dragged to that spot. It was July 18, 1980, the beginning of a haunting mystery surrounding an unidentified victim, now known only as the Ventura County Jane Doe. Police determined the victim was a petite young woman of Hispanic and/or Native American heritage. Tragically, she was about 4 to 5 months pregnant when she was slain, and evidence showed that she had given birth at least once prior. An autopsy showed that she had been subject to an indecent assault before the attacker finished her off. Bruises and defensive cuts on her arms and hands told investigators that she fought her attacker fiercely, doing everything she could to survive in those moments. Investigators faced an immediate challenge. Without an identity for the victim, leads were scarce. They canvassed the area for witnesses, and a motorist reported seeing a woman who matched the victim's description hitchhiking near a freeway the night before. This raised a theory that the Jane Doe might have been a hitchhiker or traveler picked up by the perpetrator. However, that tip led nowhere conclusive. The crime scene itself, a school parking area in a suburb, revealed no personal belongings or identification. By the end of 1980, the trail had gone cold and would remain that way for decades. In 2012, detectives revisiting the cold case turned to DNA. The perpetrator had left traces of himself, notably foreign DNA under the victim's fingernails from her desperate struggle. Modern forensic testing yielded a DNA profile of an unknown male, which was uploaded to the National CODIS database. In 2013, the cold case got a huge break when the evidence matched an inmate in a California prison, Wilson Chust. While he had never been on the cops' radar, Chust was far from a random suspect. He was a convicted violent felon with a history of crimes involving abductions. In fact, records showed he had been paroled in June 1980, just weeks before the Jane Doe's slaying, and by September 1980, he was arrested again for unrelated crimes against women. The DNA hit linked Chust not only to the Ventura County Jane Doe, but also to another unsolved 1980 slaying of a young woman in Kern County. Notably, both women had significant indigenous ancestry, suggesting that this was part of his victim profile. In 2015, he was formally charged with the 1980 attacks, but despite overwhelming evidence, he denied any involvement, offering no information about the victims' identities. The case went to trial in 2018, 38 years after the crimes, and despite both women being unidentified, he was found guilty on both charges. In the years following, one of the women was identified as Shirley Souze, a Cree woman from Alberta in Canada. However, the Ventura County Jane Doe remained unidentified. In 2018, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project. They extracted the victim's DNA and used it to search genealogy databases for family matches, and the results were intriguing. Her DNA pointed toward an indigenous Mexican or Central American background, which aligned with her physical traits and the initial anthropological assessment. Genetic genealogy soon linked the unknown woman to distant cousins. They traced family roots to Zacatecas, Mexico, and discovered very distant cousins who lived in the Los Angeles area. This strongly suggests that the Jane Doe or her immediate family may have come from that region and later settled in Southern California. A major development came in 2021 when genealogists managed to identify the father of the Jane Doe's unborn baby. He turned out to be a man from Honduras who had been living in Los Angeles around 1980. Detectives were able to locate and interview him, and he confirmed he had a relationship with a young woman around that time, but he didn't know her full identity. Unfortunately, he couldn't give much in the way of biographical details about her either, though he does appear to have confirmed that she wasn't born in America. Notably, the authorities don't believe he was involved in the Jane Doe's passing in any way whatsoever, and continue to believe the convicted perpetrator acted alone. Still, personally, I find it quite unusual that this man claims to have been in a relationship with this woman, yet couldn't even remember the most basic biographical details about her. I would expect that he would have at least been able to remember a first name, or where she was originally from, or anything rather than simply nothing. At any rate, All these clues have shaped working theories about who the Jane Doe was. She might have left home as a teenager or young adult, which could be why no immediate family reported her missing. The hitchhiking report supports the idea that she was transient or traveling when she crossed paths with Chust. It's possible her relatives back in Mexico or elsewhere didn't know where to start searching when she vanished. This has led to the speculative idea that there may be a parallel missing persons investigation in Mexico or elsewhere for this young woman. One of the most haunting aspects of the Ventura County Jane Doe case is that she wasn't just a pregnant woman when she was slain. She had also given birth to at least one child before her passing. The autopsy revealed evidence of a prior cesarean scar, which indicated that she delivered a child years earlier. That fact deepens the tragedy, but also provides investigators with a potential path forward. If that earlier child survived and is still alive today, they may carry the crucial genetic link that could finally unlock this Jane Doe's identity. After all, genetic genealogy thrives on locating close relatives, and a direct descendant represents the most definitive match. In 1998, a famous spiritual guru and cult leader perished, and days later his devoted disciples vanished without a trace. Taisha Abelar and 4 other women from the same unusual cult went missing along with her. Decades later, the fate of Taisha and her companions remains one of California's most haunting, obscure, unsolved mysteries. Taisha Abelar was born Mary Ann Simcoe and was an American anthropologist and author, and one of the closest disciples of Carlos Castaneda. Castaneda was a New Age guru and best-selling writer whose tales of a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan fascinated millions in the 1970s. Notably, these stories of this so-called real shaman are now suspected to have been faked, with Castaneda himself using this fictional character as the basis for his New Age movement. He was also an anthropology professor at UCLA, which gave him access to young women who he could recruit into his budding cult. In the early 1970s, as a student at UCLA, Abelar met Castaneda and soon joined his inner circle of female followers, a group he called the Witches. She embraced Castaneda's philosophy of erasing personal history. She changed her name, cut off contact with her family, and shrouded her life in secrecy. Abelar lived at Castaneda's Los Angeles compound and devoted herself entirely to his quote-unquote mystical teachings. Shockingly, like all the other members of his all-female inner circle, she was also romantically involved with the guru. Carlos Castaneda died on April 27, 1998, from liver cancer. Castaneda had taught that he was an enlightened sorcerer who could leave this world in a truly miraculous way. His followers believed this wholeheartedly, but he perished in a mundane way and was quietly cremated. Just days after his passing, Taisha Abelar gathered up the 4 other closest associates of Castaneda. These women were Florinda Donner, Amalia Marquez, Kylie Lundahl, and Patricia Parton, all of these names being the alternative identities they had adopted as part of the group. They left behind no public announcements or goodbyes, having already severed ties with outsiders long before. At first, few even noticed they were gone, since the group's secretive lifestyle meant there were no immediate reports. Only months later did the peculiar truth emerge. The women known as Castaneda's witches had all slipped away after his passing. For several years, no trace of Taisha Abelar or the others turned up. Some believed that they had gone to Mexico and posted up near where Castaneda's cremated remains had been released. After all, they were crazy cultists, and cultists are necessarily going to do weird and unusual things. Then in 2003, hikers in Death Valley National Park came upon human skeletal remains bleached by the desert sun. The remains were eventually identified as Patricia Parton, one of the 5 missing women and Castaneda's longtime disciple, whom he had nicknamed his, quote, Blue Scout. Parton's car was reportedly found abandoned near a remote sand dune, not far from where her bones lay. This grim discovery intensified fears about the fate of Abelard and the others. Despite extensive wilderness searches, no evidence of the other 4 women was found in the area. Parton's death in the desert raised more questions than answers. An investigation suggested she may have died from dehydration or exposure, but there were puzzling signs that suggested she may have done it on purpose. Meanwhile, the missing women's families were left in limbo, desperate for answers. Some relatives even organized searches in Death Valley years later, scouring abandoned mines and desert expanses for any trace. But these efforts turned up nothing. After long years of false leads and frustration, most loved ones came to accept that Abelard and the others were likely never coming back. Over the year, several theories have been put forward about what happened to these missing women. The most widespread theory is that Abelard and the 4 women committed to leaving this earthly plane voluntarily after Castaneda's death. The idea of such a disturbing mass act immediately drew comparisons to infamous cult tragedies like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate. Former insiders have noted that the idea of following him into the next life was openly discussed in the group's final days. Castaneda's top female followers were fiercely loyal, and by some accounts they had long agreed not to outlive their guru. One former member even recalled that Florinda Donner, one of the missing women, even talked about using her pilot's license to fly a plane into a Hawaiian volcano. This was apparently theorized to be some sort of bizarre way to achieve spiritual enlightenment. The discovery of Parton's body in Death Valley gave credence to the idea. Perhaps the desert was chosen as a solemn location for their final exit. However, the major complication is that only Parton's remains have been found. If all 5 went into Death Valley together for a last act, it's curious that only one set of remains turned up. This has led some observers to question whether a synchronized event truly occurred, or if the story was more complicated. Another theory claims that Taisha Abelard and the others deliberately vanished to start new lives elsewhere. In this scenario, their disappearance was an orchestrated escape from scrutiny. There's evidence that in the weeks around Castaneda's death, his inner circle made plans for a possible getaway. They reportedly considered purchasing a large ocean-going vessel, as if preparing to literally sail off into the sunset and beyond the reach of authorities. Further, Abelard and her peers were well versed in adopting new identities. They had lived under aliases for years, and had cut ties with family, which would make disappearing easier. Financially, they weren't destitute, and Castaneda left a substantial sum of money and ongoing royalties from his book sales to this group of women. Some have speculated that this act is a clear indication that Castaneda had intended for the women to live and carry on their lives after he was gone. Investigations into the estate even hinted that some assets might have been siphoned off or hidden. It's conceivable that Abelard and her companions quietly took the money and fled the country. Some believe they could have gone to Latin America or Europe to live out their days under the radar. Given their lifelong practice of secrecy, they might have succeeded in staying hidden if they chose this path. However, until this day, no sightings of the women have ever occurred. A more sinister theory focuses on internal dynamics within the group. This hypothesis suggests that not everyone disappeared willingly or together. Notably, Patricia Parton was much younger, and some believe the others saw her as a liability when Castaneda was gone. Parton's own family members suspect that the group deliberately sent her to the desert on a false premise, intending to abandon her there. Under this theory, Parton may have been sacrificed to provide cover for the rest of the group. since finding her would imply that all members of the group perished. As of today, the disappearance of Taisha Abelar and the three other women remains unsolved. No official answers have ever emerged, and the case is as cold as it is disturbing. If Abelar were alive now, she would be in her 70s. Yet there has not been a single credible sighting or clue of her existence since 1998. Most who have examined the case lean toward the belief that all the missing women are likely deceased, whether by their own design or through some tragedy tied to their cult's collapse. When I think about Taisha Abelar's disappearance, I keep coming back to the possibility that she and some of the others actually managed to escape. Unlike other people I've profiled who may have disappeared intentionally, her life had always been defined by secrecy, discipline, and a careful crafting of new identities. She had already erased her past once, cutting ties with her family and even changing her name, so it seems plausible that she could have done it all over again. Further, the timing was perfect. Castaneda's demise created a distraction, and his estate provided money that could have fueled a fresh start. Further yet, there were financial irregularities with the estate, suggesting that she and other members may have been squirreling away resources in advance of Castaneda's passing. Abelar was intelligent, resourceful, and deeply committed to staying hidden from the outside world. It's not hard to imagine her slipping away under a new alias, perhaps abroad, where no one would ever think to look. Hey everyone, Jimmy here as usual, with a big shout out to all subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Also, don't forget to check out my new history video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. Also, don't forget to leave your suggestions for cases for me to cover in the comments. Don't be shy. It doesn't have to be some ultra-obscure mystery. I've literally had people suggest I look into Bigfoot or Jack the Ripper. For more than 30 years after 1930, a lone woman would slip into a quiet Greenwich Village bar every August 6th and order 2 cocktails. She would raise 1 glass in a silent toast to her absent companion, then depart, leaving the second drink untouched. The woman was Stella Crater, and the toast was for her missing husband, Judge Joseph Force Crater, who vanished on a warm summer night in 1930 and never returned. Crater's disappearance shocked the nation and became an instant media sensation. To this day, what happened to Judge Crater remains one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries, a true tale of a man who stepped into a taxi and was never seen again. Joseph Force Crater was no ordinary missing person. He was a prominent New York judge and attorney at the height of a successful career. Born in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents in Pennsylvania, Crater climbed the ranks of the legal world through talent and political savvy. He practiced law in Manhattan and became deeply involved with Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics. Through his work with Tammany leader Martin Healy, Crater earned lucrative court appointments and cultivated influential connections. In one notable case in 1929, he handled a hotel foreclosure that led to a spectacular profit for a well-connected buyer, raising eyebrows about insider deal-making in Crater's circle. By 1930, Crater's loyalty and networking paid off. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to fill a vacancy on the New York State Supreme Court, a prestigious judgeship, in April of that year. At just 41 years old, Crater was considered very young for the position and was seen as a rising star in New York's judiciary, backed by both political patronage and genuine ability. Justice Crater was even seen as someone who may eventually make it onto the Supreme Court one day. Despite his marriage to Stella, Judge Crater had a reputation as a man about town, and he had no problem doing a little bit of pipe-fitting work on the side. Tall, well-dressed, and sociable, He loved the nightlife of jazz-age New York. Friends nicknamed him Good Time Joe for his penchant for piano playing, dancing, and mingling with showgirls and Broadway speakeasies. He moved in both high society and more unsavory circles, rubbing elbows with politicians, business magnates, and the occasional gangster. In the summer of 1930, only months after Crater joined the state Supreme Court, trouble was brewing in New York's halls of power. The Manhattan District Attorney had launched a corruption inquiry into Tammany Hall's practice of selling judgeships to the highest bidder. Judge Crater appeared unperturbed at first, vacationing with Stella at their lakeside summer home in Maine. But on August 3rd, 1930, Crater received an urgent phone call and abruptly announced to his wife that he had to return to the city to straighten things out. He promised to be back in Maine in time for Stella's birthday on August 9th. In reality, instead of immediately tending to any official business, Crater detoured to the beach resort of Atlantic City with a young showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz, in tow. And yeah, since I can't resist a good bit of humor, it appears that the good judge was straightening certain things out, at the very least. This secret jaunt with a chorus girl would only come to light later, hinting that Crater had personal matters, or pleasures, occupying his time even as political storms gathered. Judge Crater arrived back in Manhattan on August 6, 1930, the last day he was seen alive. That morning, he went into his chambers at the courthouse and spent a couple of hours methodically sorting through his files, even reportedly destroying some documents. He had his assistant cash 2 checks for him and withdrew the modern equivalent of almost $100,000. Crater and the assistant then brought 2 locked briefcases from his office to his apartment, after which the judge dismissed his aide for the day. These actions later struck investigators as suspicious, as if Crater were tying up loose ends or stashing something important. That evening, Judge Crater continued his routine of enjoying the town. He purchased a ticket for a new Broadway comedy at the Belasco Theater, and then headed to dinner at Billy Hass's Chop House on West 45th Street. His dining companions were William Klein, a fellow lawyer and friend, and the ever-present Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl from his Atlantic City trip. The trio ate, drank, and laughed together, with Crater reportedly in fine spirits. Sometime around 9 that evening, as the group stood outside the restaurant, Crater hailed a taxicab passing by. No one would ever definitively see Judge Joseph Crater again. At first, no alarm was raised, and when Crater failed to return to Maine for Stella's birthday, she grew annoyed, but assumed her husband's work had delayed him. Crater's colleagues in New York also thought little of his absence, believing he was still vacationing in Maine. Only after a week passed with no word did Stella begin making anxious phone calls to friends in the city, searching for any sign of him. On August 25th, the New York courts reopened for a new term and were notably 1 judge short. Crater's fellow justices, realizing he was neither in Maine nor at work, initiated quiet inquiries into his whereabouts. When these discreet efforts turned up nothing, the police were finally notified on September 3rd, 1930. The story of the missing judge hit the front pages the next day, and a frenzy of speculation ensued. A massive investigation swung into motion. Detectives discovered that Crater's personal safe deposit box had been mysteriously emptied, and those 2 briefcases he'd taken home had vanished without a trace. These leads went nowhere, however, as tips and alleged sightings of the missing judge flooded in from all over. In October 1930, a grand jury was impaneled to examine the case in exhaustive detail. 95 witnesses were called and nearly 1,000 pages of testimony collected. The inquiry delved into Crater's bank records, phone calls, and relationships, trying to piece together a puzzle with precious few pieces. Throughout, Stella Crater remained in Maine, refusing to face what she considered accusatory treatment by authorities and scandal-hungry newspapers. In January 1931, after months of hearings, the grand jury concluded its investigation with a frustrating shrug. In short, they couldn't say if he was alive or dead, let alone what caused his disappearance. In a bizarre twist, just days after the grand jury disbanded, Stella Crater made a discovery that only deepened the mystery. While cleaning out her husband's dresser back in their New York apartment, she found a secret compartment containing 4 envelopes. Inside were stacks of stocks and bonds, checks, life insurance papers, and Crater's will, all documents that had been missed in prior police searches. There was also a handwritten note from Crater himself. In it, the judge had listed various debts owed to him and included a brief, poignant message to Stella that hinted at his despair and ended with a loving goodbye. The cache suggested that Crater might have anticipated some trouble, but it yielded no concrete clues as to his fate. He was officially declared dead in absentia in 1939, allowing Stella to collect life insurance. Decades later, in 1979, the NYPD finally closed the case without resolution. From the moment the story broke in 1930, the disappearance of Judge Crater generated a whirlwind of theories. Over the years, professional investigators and amateur sleuths alike have proposed many possible explanations, each as compelling as it is unprovable. The tale has all the ingredients of a great mystery, including political intrigue, gangsters, showgirls, and a man who seemingly evaporated into thin air. One early theory was that Crater chose to vanish of his own accord. It seemed implausible that a man of his stature would abandon his career and wife without a word. Yet some pointed to the large sum of cash he withdrew and the documents he took as signs of a planned getaway. In the years after 1930, reported Crater sightings cropped up across the country and even overseas, fueling the idea that he might still be alive under an assumed identity. Tipsters claim to have seen a man resembling Crater in far-flung locales ranging from rural Canada to the South Pacific. Carnival workers, gold prospectors, and even a man in the French Foreign Legion were rumored to be the missing judge in disguise. Another theory suggested Crater met with an accidental death that was then covered up. For example, lurid rumors hinted he might have suffered a heart attack in the company of a lady of the night, and any witnesses disposed of the body rather than face scandal. After all, Crater was known for enjoying good times, so this didn't seem too unlikely. Given Judge Crater's ties to Tammany Hall and the timing of his disappearance, many have suspected that political corruption was at the heart of this mystery. Crater had been a cog in Tammany's powerful machine, and he literally owed his judgeship to their influence. He likely knew about the murky transactions involved in buying and selling public offices. In mid-1930, a state investigation was zeroing in on Tammany's judicial corruption, and Crater's mentor, Martin Healy, was under scrutiny. The theory goes that Crater might have been ready to talk, or at least that others feared he would talk. Eliminating the judge could have been a convenient way for higher-ups to protect themselves. Some even whispered of a connection to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then New York's governor and had presidential ambitions. The logic being that if a scandal about selling judgeships blew up, it could tarnish Roosevelt on the national stage. Notably, years later, foes of Roosevelt would insinuate that FDR's allies knew more about Crater's fate, darkly suggesting that he knew where the body was. While there's no proof of any connection to Tammany Hall, this powerful and corrupt organization had benefited from extrajudicial usage of force in the past. Closely intertwined with the political angle is the possibility that organized crime figures played a role. New York's underworld and its political world were often two sides of the same coin in that era. Judge Crater was known to enjoy late nights in the city's clubs and had rubbed shoulders with some infamous characters. He was friendly with Irish gangster Jack Diamond and distraught over the 1928 slaying of his acquaintance Arnold Rothstein. Such connections have long fed the theory that Crater knew too much about the criminal underbelly of the city. Perhaps he stumbled into information that made him a liability, or perhaps someone in the mob felt the judge hadn't delivered on a promise. Another set of theories suggests that he was blackmailed by someone he was having an affair with, or a woman of whom he was a regular client. Under this theory, he had routinely been paying off large amounts of hush money to this woman in exchange for her silence. However, it's speculated that the last payment was insufficient, and she had a local gangster take him out. Personally, I don't find this narrative to be incredibly compelling, since if it's true, she permanently cut off the source of her extortion. After all, he was a politically well-connected judge, and he would have further money or influence to extort in the future. Simply put, I think this is likely just a lurid theory that was drummed up to sell newspapers back in the day. For decades, the mystery of Judge Crater remained stubbornly unsolved until a stunning potential clue emerged 75 years later. In August 2005, New York authorities announced they had obtained new evidence in the cold case. A handwritten letter left by a 91-year-old widow named Stella Ferrucci Good. This woman had been the wife of a detective, and in a letter opened after she had perished, she revealed an explosive story her husband had allegedly told her. According to Ferrucci Good's letter, Judge Crater had indeed been slain back in 1930, not by mobsters or jilted lovers, but by two men, one of them who wore a badge. The letter named a New York City police officer, Charles Burns, and his brother Frank, who happened to be a cab driver. On the night of August 6, 1930, the story went, the Burns brothers somehow intercepted Crater. They eliminated the judge, and then buried his body under the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. Incredibly, the letter also tied Charles Burns to other violence of the era. Investigators in 2005 were initially intrigued, and they noted the area mentioned. West 8th Street on Coney Island, now the site of the New York Aquarium, had indeed been excavated during construction in the 1950s. And actually, let me just jump in here for a second, since as I was doing the editing on this video, I realized something. Coney Island isn't an actual island anymore, and hasn't been one for well over a century when an engineering project connected it to Brooklyn. Anyway, if a skeleton had been found then, it was never reported. Police records showed no such discovery, and a preliminary check of municipal works didn't turn up any bones either. This late-breaking confession left more questions than answers. No one could say if the detective's tale was true, or if it was just a fanciful story that he told to his wife. Since Stella had already passed away by the time the letter was opened, there was no opportunity to question her about the contents of the letter. Further yet, the evidence is hearsay from a person who isn't even alive, giving evidence about a supposed conversation with another person who also isn't alive. This is, of course, extremely problematic, as aside from confirming that her husband was indeed a police officer, nothing else could be known for certain. Stella herself could have simply been an avid follower of the case with a bit of a sick sense of humor, looking to insert herself into the investigation from beyond the grave. And if that was her intent, well then she definitely succeeded. At any rate, no physical evidence was recovered to substantiate the claim, and skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. In the years following Crater's disappearance, his name became a punchline and a piece of Americana, even as his wife quietly kept her vow to never forget him. The very phrase, "to pull a Crater," entered the lexicon as slang for vanishing without a trace. And from my research, it looks as though this phrase would have essentially been used in the same way we use the phrase ghosting today. Whatever the case, Justice Crater's disappearance likely remains such a popular unsolved mystery because there are so many possibilities as to what happened. Further, some of these possibilities credibly intersect with big names in both New York history and American history. Imagine a mother with nearly infinite resources in a state of extreme grief. Her beloved son, the heir to a vast fortune and an ancient title, has vanished at sea, presumed dead for over a decade. But she refuses to believe it, and she spends years and a small fortune placing ads in newspapers across the globe, clinging to the desperate hope that he survived. Then, one day, a letter from a lawyer arrives from the Australian outback, and a man has come forward saying he's her long-lost son. He's coarse, unrefined, and enormously obese, bearing little resemblance to the slender, French-speaking aristocrat who disappeared. But he claims to be her son, and against all odds, she believes him. This isn't the plot of Netflix's latest Victorian period piece, at least not yet, but rather the true story of the Tichborne case. To understand the sheer audacity of the claim, we first have to understand the man whose identity was more than likely stolen. Sir Roger Charles Tichborne was the heir to one of England's great fortunes, as well as sprawling estates in Hampshire and elsewhere. Born in Paris in 1829 and raised by his French mother, Henriette, Roger grew up speaking English with a noticeable French accent. He wasn't a storybook prince. He was described as a slender, spoiled, and ill-educated young man, fond of heavy drinking and generally profane behavior. To give a sense of how much of a rebel this guy was, he was a 19th century high nobleman with a bunch of tattoos, a fact that shocked the sensibilities of contemporaries. As a young man, he fell deeply in love with his first cousin, Catherine Doughty, but the family opposed the match for somewhat obvious reasons. Heartbroken, Roger resigned his army commission, and he embarked on a grand tour of South America in 1853 to put some distance between himself and Catherine. In April 1854, the 25-year-old boarded a ship called the Bella in Rio de Janeiro. The ship and its passengers were never seen again. When wreckage was found off the Brazilian coast, Roger Tichborne was presumed dead. Running parallel to the life of the aristocratic heir was that of a man from the other end of the social spectrum. Arthur Orton was born in 1834 in Wapping, a rough-and-tumble district of London's docks, the son of a butcher who supplied ship's stores. His world couldn't have been more different from the Tichborne estates. After leaving school early, Orton went to sea, deserted his ship in Chile, and lived there for over a year, where he was befriended by a Chilean family. During his time with the family, he took on the name Tom Castro, an identity swap that would foreshadow what would happen next. After a brief return to London, he sailed for Australia in 1852. There, his life was a gritty colonial existence of a butcher, mail runner, and station hand, with persistent rumors of horse theft and other crimes shadowing his movements. By the mid-1860s, he was living in the remote Australian town of Wagga Wagga as a butcher named Thomas Castro, married to an illiterate woman and mired in debt. While seemingly random, Orton's life experiences inadvertently provided the perfect raw material for an incredible deception. The event that brought these two disparate worlds crashing together was a mother's refusal to give up hope. Lady Tichborne never accepted Roger's death. She was spurred on by rumors of shipwreck survivors in Australia and the pronouncements of a clairvoyant. Due to this, she began a relentless campaign of newspaper advertisements, offering a quote-unquote handsome reward for any information about her son. And if there was anyone who was able to pay out a big fat reward, it was Lady Tichborne. In 1865, a lawyer in Wagga Wagga, William Gibbs, saw the ad and connected it to his bankrupt client, Tom Castro. He encouraged Castro to make the claim, and soon, letters were on their way to England. From then on, this man of many names would often be known as the Tichborne claimant, or simply the claimant for short. The correspondence was riddled with errors. For instance, the claimant called his mother Hannah Francis and made mistakes about the family properties. But Lady Tichborne was undeterred. She sent money for his passage, and in January 1867, they met in Paris. Despite him speaking no French whatsoever, she immediately and unequivocally recognized the claimant as her son. Notably, the uncanny resemblance between the two men is one of the most mysterious aspects of this case, and long fueled the rumor that the claimant was perhaps an illegitimate child of the family. She granted him an income of £1,000 a year, giving his audacious claim the one thing it desperately needed: legitimacy. And as a quick aside, this is the equivalent of almost £200,000 per year at present in an allowance alone. He was also given residence in Tichborne Park, a sprawling country estate where he allegedly grew up. The claimant was given full access to all the luxuries of an estate owner during the time period. Basically think Downton Abbey, with a full array of servants. The income he was granted was, in essence, play money, so to speak, as he had no real expenses to speak of, with everything being covered by his alleged mother. Right from the very beginning, many people were extremely skeptical about the claimant. Skeptics felt that Lady Tichborne's grief didn't just lead her to find her son, it effectively recreated him, transforming a provincial con man into a national celebrity. The case exploded into a Victorian media sensation, captivating the public for the better part of a decade. Newspapers provided daily coverage, and the story became a form of national entertainment. The affair cleaved society in two, primarily along class lines: the establishment, the aristocracy, the government, and the legal profession was almost universally against the claimant. But the working classes rallied to his side, seeing him as a popular hero, a rough-hewn colonial underdog doing battle with a corrupt and snobbish elite. For them, it was less about belief in the fact that the claimant was actually Sir Roger. The fact that he was so obviously not Sir Roger was what brought so much joy to many of them. They were simply happy to see buffoonish aristocrats mauling over the presence of the claimant living in their midst, being forced to treat him as their equal. Well, that was at least while Lady Tichborne was alive and providing him protection. When she passed away, the whole case would heat up big time. After Lady Tichborne died in 1868, the claimant's main source of funding vanished. In a stroke of genius, his supporters launched an innovative crowdfunding scheme known as Tichborne Bonds. These bonds were sold to the public, guaranteeing a payout of £100 if the claimant won his inheritance. The scheme was a wild success, raising an astonishing £40,000 and demonstrating the incredible depth of his popular support. To put it in context, this is well over £6 million today. People weren't just following a story, they were literally investing in a man's identity, turning his claim into a speculative asset on the stock market of public opinion. Unfortunately for early investors, this was basically the 19th century version of a cryptocurrency rug pull. I'm sure the 19th century version of CoffeeZilla was all over him for this. The first great legal battle began in May 1871. The civil trial, ostensibly an action to eject him as a tenant from Tichborne Park, was in reality a trial of identity. The claimant's case rested almost entirely on personal recognition. Over 100 witnesses, former soldiers, servants, and associates, swore that he was Roger Tichborne. He seemed to recall intimate details from Roger's past, like the name of a pet dog, which lent his story an air of credibility. Further, the claimant seemed fairly well versed in Catholic tradition, and while Sir Roger perhaps wasn't the most devout Catholic, he absolutely grew up immersed in the tradition. This was later explained by the fact that the claimant's wife was indeed Catholic, and that he had apparently converted while in Australia. But his case crumbled during 22 grueling days of cross-examination. Under the piercing questions of the family's lawyer, his ignorance was laid bare. He couldn't speak or understand a word of French, Sir Roger's childhood language, which the real man spoke at a native level. In fact, the real Roger was said to have spoken French much more proficiently than he did English. Notably, the claimant also knew nothing about Stonyhurst, the elite school Roger had attended, and where he spent many of his formative years. He was also unable to properly identify his friends from this time, a fact that was considered to be virtually inconceivable for someone of his class. These connections made at these elite private schools didn't simply vanish, and the real Sir Roger had maintained close ties to his old boys network up until he disappeared. Simply put, this wasn't just a case of not remembering some kids he went to school with. This was more akin to not remembering members of your lifelong social circle. He couldn't even recognize his own mother's handwriting, and had no memory of a sealed package Roger had left with a servant before his fateful voyage. Further, despite being a 19th century nobleman, Roger had tattoos, while the claimant didn't, and trust me, there was no tattoo removal available at the time. A big part of the case against the claimant was how morbidly obese the claimant was. Roger was known to be slender, while the claimant was 400 pounds, a weight almost unheard of in this era. Notably, extensive weight was placed on this fact, despite this being objectively one of the least fishy things about his case. The real Roger Tichborne could indeed have become old and obese, especially given his excessive lifestyle and extreme indulgence in food and drink. Ultimately, given the weight of the evidence against him, the claimant was evicted from Tichborne Park, but the worst for him was yet to come. The second trial, a criminal matter which began in April 1873, was even more epic, lasting 188 days and becoming one of the longest in English history. The goal now wasn't just to disprove the Tichborne identity, but to affirmatively prove the Orton identity. The prosecution brought forward 215 witnesses. People from Wapping identified the claimant as their old neighbor, whom some identified as Arthur Orton. Evidence emerged that upon his arrival in England, the claimant had made a suspicious trip to Wapping to ask about the status of the Orton family. Handwriting experts also testified that his script matched Orton's, not Tichborne's, though I have to question the legitimacy of such expert testimony. Handwriting analysis isn't an exact science even today, and I strongly suspect the 19th century version of it was even more questionable. The defense staked its hopes on a dramatic surprise witness, a Danish sailor who claimed to have been on the ship that rescued the Bella's survivors. But the prosecution quickly exposed this Danish sailor as a recently released convict who had previous convictions for perjury, and his testimony backfired catastrophically. After 188 days of testimony, the jury took less than half an hour to find the claimant guilty. They declared he was not Roger Tichborne, he was Arthur Orton, and sentenced him to 14 years of hard labor for perjury. Interestingly, the last convicts were shipped off to Australia in the 1860s, so Arthur just missed the cutoff for an all-expenses-paid cruise back to his adopted homeland. Also, just as a quick aside, this may have been the worst jury to serve on in history, as the jurors were paid the equivalent of about £10 per day in present day currency. After serving 10 years, the man the law now called Arthur Orton was released from prison in 1884. The popular movement that had once hailed him as a hero had fizzled out. He tried to cash in on his fame on the music hall circuit, regaling people with the stories of his time as Sir Roger, but interest had waned significantly while he was locked up. In 1895, living in poverty, he accepted money from a newspaper to publish a confession that he was indeed Arthur Orton, only to retract it almost immediately. He died destitute on April 1st, 1898. In a final baffling twist, the Tichborne family, who had spent a fortune to expose him as a fraud, either provided or explicitly allowed a plate to be placed on his coffin bearing a certain name. That plate bore the name Sir Roger Charles Doty Tichborne, providing proof in the eyes of his sympathizers that the claimant may not have been Arthur Orton after all. In the early hours of May 7th, 1988, a chilling sound crept through the walls of a quiet Burbank apartment building. Muffled shrieks and high-pitched moans jarred awake 23-year-old Susan Aiken, a former Miss America. She listened in alarm with her fiancé as the mysterious cries continued rhythmically for nearly an hour. Less than a week later, on Friday the 13th of May, neighbors complained of a foul odor from that same upstairs unit. Police responded and discovered the lifeless body of 29-year-old Crystal Spencer lying face down on the floor of her apartment. Crystal Spencer was an ambitious young woman with Hollywood aspirations. She grew up in a small Northern California town, and after her father passed away when she was just 8, life got a lot more difficult for her. Crystal ended up having to leave high school early to help her mom support the family. In her early 20s, she moved to Los Angeles dreaming of stardom. But like many hopeful actresses, she found only bit parts and frustration in her first years. To make ends meet, Crystal reluctantly took a job as a dancer at the Wild Goose, an adult club near Los Angeles International Airport. She wasn't happy that she was in this line of work, and Crystal never abandoned her Hollywood dreams. She landed a couple of small roles, including 2 TV commercials, and enrolled in drama and comedy workshops to hone her craft. By 1988, at 29 years old, she was still striving for that big break. In 1987, she had begun dating Anton Klein, a 37-year-old aspiring screenwriter whom she met at a garden party. For several months, Crystal hid her dancing job from him, afraid of losing his respect and that it would cause them to break up. When Anton eventually discovered her other life, he was shocked but accepted it, and the two stayed together. In early 1988, a new opportunity on the horizon gave her hope. Crystal was preparing to spend 3 months in Japan working as a nightclub hostess, a job that promised quick money and a chance to step up from the dancing scene. She confided to a friend that the idea of moving to Japan made her nervous, but she was determined to go through with it. On Wednesday, May 4th, Anton stopped by Crystal's Burbank apartment because she was homesick with what seemed like a bad cold. He brought her groceries and noted that she appeared to be in good spirits. The next night, Thursday, May 5th, would be the last time Crystal spoke with her family. Late that evening, Crystal phoned her sister, Julie, sounding distressed and claiming she had come down with a terrible flu. She wanted to know what number their mom could be reached at, since their mom was staying with friends in Los Angeles, while Crystal planned to leave for Japan. She begged Julie for their mother's phone number, desperate to reach her mom for comfort or help, but Julie thought Crystal was being dramatic and told her she didn't have it. As midnight passed into the early hours of May 6th, troubling signs continued at Crystal's apartment. Very late that night, unusual noises emanated from her unit. One neighbor later told police they had heard sounds throughout the day and into the night that sounded a lot like violent vomiting. Then came the harrowing screams that Susan Aiken and her fiancé heard in the early hours. As mentioned, due to the rhythmic style of agony they heard, they assumed that a couple were taking a walk on the wild side and didn't call the cops. This decision, not to call the cops because they didn't want to interrupt a freaky night going on upstairs, would come to haunt the couple. Meanwhile, Anton Klein was growing concerned. All through that weekend, he repeatedly tried calling Crystal, but her phone line was persistently busy. Eventually, a phone operator informed him that the line wasn't just busy. The telephone receiver in Crystal's apartment was off the hook, effectively disabling incoming calls. On Monday, May 9th, with still no word from Crystal, Anton took an extra step. He phoned the Wild Goose Club where she worked and asked the doorman if anyone had seen her. The response he got was strange and unexpected, since Anton was informed that Crystal had left for Japan. Anton was rather heartbroken that she had left without saying goodbye, but ultimately decided to reluctantly accept what he was told. On May 13th, 1988, nearly 1 week after the mysterious late-night screams, the truth of Crystal's fate was finally revealed. Neighbors, unable to ignore the awful smell seeping through the building's hallway, called the police. Officers entered Crystal Spencer's apartment and found her on the living room floor. Crystal's body had lain there for days, decomposing in the spring heat. She was found wearing only a red top, with no clothing from the waist down, and her telephone was off its hook next to her, the cord wrapped around her legs. The apartment itself was in disarray, belongings scattered about, which could have indicated a struggle or break-in, although friends noted Crystal wasn't the tidiest person to begin with. One responding officer noted immediate suspicion of a possible slaying given the state of the apartment and her body. However, with the corpse so badly decayed, it was difficult to discern much from the crime scene. Notably, there were absolutely no signs of trauma that could be conclusively identified on the remains. Further yet, investigators found no trace of substances in Crystal's system either. In the absence of clear evidence, the coroner could not determine how Crystal Spencer perished. After a thorough autopsy, the cause was officially recorded as undetermined, essentially acknowledging that the forensic experts were unable to say what ended her life. When Crystal Spencer's remains were first examined, the coroner's office registered them as a Jane Doe. Her body was so decomposed that staff had to remove her fingertips surgically just to get prints for identification. This autopsy would cause a significant degree of controversy for Crystal's family and friends. It listed a 5'7", 140-pound woman, while Crystal was barely 5 feet tall and just over 100 pounds. Anton Klein suggested that her body may have been switched out either accidentally or on purpose. However, the authorities explained that the height discrepancy was likely a clerical error, and the weight discrepancy came from not factoring in the weight of the gurney. Notably, the authorities tested her fingerprints 2 more times to ensure the proper body had been examined, which they were able to confirm. Questions also arose about the initial police investigation. Burbank police did look into Crystal's passing, but only briefly. They processed the apartment and interviewed a few people, yet within a few months the department quietly closed the case, having found no concrete evidence of foul play. Eventually, by the summer of 1988, Crystal's file was marked as a passing due to probable natural causes. This conclusion infuriated Crystal's family and Anton Klein, who believed the police had been too quick to write off the case. Anton and Crystal's family took it upon themselves to find what the police didn't. In the days after the autopsy, Crystal's relatives went through her disheveled apartment and discovered a potential clue that investigators had left behind. Crystal's camera. This camera had a roll of undeveloped film still inside, and the police had not confiscated it or even noted its existence. Anton had the film developed on his own, and the photos revealed something intriguing. It showed a middle-aged man with a mustache sitting in Crystal's apartment, smiling at the camera. This unknown man's presence raised alarm bells. Anton managed to obtain Crystal's phone records and, playing detective, matched a number to the mystery man's identity, then handed this information to the Burbank police. Detectives did track the man down and interview him, and in the end, he was ruled out as a suspect. More than 3 decades later, the death of Crystal Spencer remains an unsolved puzzle, and people still debate whether she perished from natural causes, or was the victim of a sinister plot. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain what might have happened in that Burbank apartment in May 1988. One possibility is that Crystal did, in fact, die of a medical issue, a rapid and severe illness that struck suddenly. No definitive illness was identified in the autopsy, but not every condition leaves obvious traces. It's conceivable that severe complications from the flu or another natural cause took her life quickly. Proponents of this theory point out that no evidence of violence was found on her body, and the coroner couldn't pinpoint any injury or toxin, which might indicate a medical cause. However, the natural death hypothesis struggles to explain the haunting screams heard in the night. Some have suggested that it's unusual for someone dying of illness to make the kind of prolonged, shrill cries that were described. Further, it doesn't fully explain why she wouldn't have called an ambulance as her condition was worsening. However, those who believe this theory generally think that she did make an attempt to call 911, but only did so when it was too late. Many, including Crystal's family, strongly suspect that she met with foul play. The screams heard by multiple neighbors bolster the idea that she wasn't alone and was in severe distress. If this theory is true, the identity of the attacker remains unknown, and no direct suspects have ever been identified publicly. It could have been a stranger, perhaps a patron or stalker from the club, or someone Crystal knew casually. It could even be someone such as a boyfriend who inserted himself into the investigation consistently over the following years. But that's just speculation, of course. Notably, there were no signs of forced entry reported, but Crystal might have opened her door willingly if she recognized the visitor. Unfortunately, the delayed discovery of her body meant much of the evidence which may have existed could have vanished by the time the cops found her body. One particularly tangled theory involves a corrupt ex-cop and the criminal underworld orbiting the adult club scene. Horace McKenna was a former California Highway Patrol officer who, according to rumor, allegedly secretly owned or controlled the Wild Goose where Crystal worked. According to an LA Times report, McKenna was said to run an illegal gambling operation out of an Inglewood warehouse. In fact, a waitress friend of Crystal's later attested that Crystal had spent time at this clandestine casino, possibly rubbing shoulders with dangerous people in McKenna's circle. The theory goes that Crystal might have become an informant on McKenna's illicit activities. Notably, in favor of this theory, it turned out that the FBI had an open file on Crystal, which Anton obtained. The only problem was that the file was almost entirely redacted. According to this theory, McKenna ordered the hit and then used his significant connections within the Los Angeles Police Department to botch the investigation. However, McKenna himself was eliminated just months later, and no evidence ever tied him to Crystal's demise. Another theory branches off from Crystal's planned trip to Japan. Some have wondered if the offer to work as a nightclub hostess in Tokyo wasn't as quote-unquote innocent as it seemed. During the 1980s, there were real instances of young American women being lured abroad for hostess jobs that ended up being fronts for forced exploitation. Now, this theory really gets into wild and speculative territory. So I mentioned that there was initially some doubt about whether the body examined was Crystal's, due to some issues with mismatches in information. This theory claims that the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, kidnapped Crystal and then shipped her to Japan or Hawaii, and then put another body in her apartment. Notably, the authorities double-checked the fingerprints on the body twice and determined that they were indeed from Crystal. Notably, there's been no connection whatsoever found between the Yakuza and Crystal. To this day, it remains entirely unclear whether Crystal was the victim of a crime or whether she simply perished due to natural causes. However, personally, I can't accept that Crystal's death was simply natural or accidental. The condition of her body, left to decompose for nearly a week, may have erased the very signs that would have revealed the truth. Advanced decomposition can obscure bruising, subtle trauma, or even evidence of strangulation if the hyoid bone wasn't broken. The fact that she was found half-clothed, the phone ripped from its base, and neighbors reported hearing what sounded like screams makes me strongly suspect foul play. Hey everyone, Jimmy here as usual with a shout out to all subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Also, don't forget to check out my new history video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. On a spring day in 1980, a hiker in Canada's Algonquin Provincial Park wandered off the trail and stumbled upon a chilling discovery: human remains hidden beneath the forest floor. Scattered around were personal items weathered by the seasons: a single boot, a leather wallet, a sleeping bag, clothing, and camping gear. There was no identification on the body, only these haunting clues in the dirt. It would take nearly half a century for the truth to emerge, finally revealing the fate of Ricky Singer, a 22-year-old from Ohio who vanished without a trace in 1973. Ricky Singer grew up in the Cleveland, Ohio area and was known for being a free spirit. In 1970, at age 19, he dropped out of college after receiving a draft card for the Vietnam War, an event that prompted him to head north to Canada in search of a different path. Ricky spent the next few years living in Canada, exploring options for school and work. By the fall of 1973, 22-year-old Ricky was back home in Ohio for a short stay with his parents. Then, on October 3rd, 1973, he packed a backpack, hopped on his bicycle, and rode off, telling no one exactly where he was going. That day was the last time his family ever saw him. When Ricky failed to stay in contact, his worried relatives filed a missing persons report and even hired a private investigator, but no leads turned up. Unbeknownst to his family, Ricky's journey led him back to Canada once more. Given his love of travel and nature, it's believed he ventured into the wilds of the Canadian province of Ontario for a solitary trip. He had been spending a lot of time in Canada already, and he likely felt comfortable there. What we know for certain is that Ricky never returned home after October 1973. Decades would pass before his loved ones got any answers, as his disappearance gradually transformed into a cold case. Fast forward to April 19, 1980. A hiker trekking near the Hardwood Lookout Trail in Algonquin Provincial Park made a grisly find just off the path. Partially buried under leaves and soil were human remains, which at first appeared to be a shallow grave of some sort. The Ontario Provincial Police from the nearby Whitney Detachment arrived and conducted a thorough search of the area over the following days. They recovered a number of items at what looked like an old campsite. These personal effects painted a portrait of a young outdoorsman who had been prepared to camp in the wilderness. Notably, no driver's license, passport, or any form of identification was found. Investigators determined that the remains belonged to a white male, likely between 18 and 21 years old at the time of death. Based on the decomposition and condition of the campsite, they estimated he had died several years before, roughly sometime between 1971 and 1978. Importantly, the forensic examination found no obvious signs of foul play. It appeared this young man's life had ended due to misadventure or natural causes rather than violence, but stay tuned because we'll get back to that shortly. Despite these clues, the police had no name to go on. They compared the John Doe's description and belongings against missing persons reports from both Canada and the United States, but initially nothing matched. Public appeals were made, and the story of the unidentified remains in Algonquin Park was circulated in the media. Yet no one came forward to claim the young man. As weeks turned into months, the Algonquin Park John Doe case went cold. His remains were laid to rest without a name, and for years the mystery lingered in the back of investigators' minds. In March 1995, 15 years after the initial discovery, a new break in the case occurred, though it only deepened the mystery at first. Another hiker found a human jawbone along the same trail, not far from the 1980 spot where the other remains were found. Investigators immediately recalled the previous body that was found and set out to prove or disprove the relationship between the two sets of human remains. Forensic tests confirmed the jawbone belonged to the same unknown individual, indicating that animals had scattered parts of the skeleton over time. The police organized another search of the area, but no further remains or clues were located beyond that single bone, and the case, once again, fell dormant. DNA testing was done at the time and was compared to databases over the years, but another major breakthrough in technology would be required to give Singer his name back. In 2022, investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy and teamed up with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization that uses genealogical databases to solve these cases. And yeah, just a big shout out to this group in general for all the great work they do. They're a nonprofit that relies on funding from everyone, so consider making a donation if you've got the spare resources. Anyway, by late 2023, this painstaking genetic detective work paid off. The DNA Doe Project team discovered a cluster of relatives in the database that led them to a family in the United States. In September 2023, detectives contacted two sisters, Ruth and Mary Singer, with astonishing news. They believed the long-lost Algonquin Park John Doe was in fact Ricky Singer, their brother who had disappeared 50 years earlier. The sisters provided their own DNA samples to the investigators, which allowed for a direct family confirmation of the match. It wasn't a quick process by any means, and final verification took nearly a year and a half, but on February 14th, 2025, investigators confirmed the remains belonged to Ricky. In the summer of 2025, Ricky's sisters traveled up to Algonquin Provincial Park to walk the forest trail where their brother's life had ended. This emotional pilgrimage brought some degree of solace to the family, who had spent over half a century wondering where Ricky was. With Ricky Singer's identity known, the big question now turns to what happened to him. The official investigation turned up no evidence of foul play. However, his body was skeletonized at the time he was found. This means that there could have been significant soft tissue trauma that was lost due to the process of decomposition. Personally, I think it's possible that he could have run into a dangerous individual while off the beaten path in this national park, though obviously the evidence isn't there to prove it. The authorities, for their part, consider the most plausible theory that Ricky fell victim to the unforgiving wilderness. He may have gotten lost or injured while hiking alone. Algonquin Park spans thousands of miles of dense forest, lakes, and rocky terrain, an easy place for even an experienced outdoorsman to get turned around or hurt. If Ricky had an accident or simply became disoriented and strayed from the trail, he could have succumbed to exposure. A lone camper in the woods, without a way to call for help, can quickly find themselves in a life-threatening situation. Notably, hypothermia is a constant danger in Ontario's backcountry, especially if Ricky was camping in the autumn when temperatures can drop rapidly at night. An early winter storm or cold snap could have overwhelmed him if he wasn't prepared for severe weather. Unfortunately, death by misadventure leaves little forensic trace, and a case of hypothermia or exhaustion wouldn't show up in skeletal remains. Another possibility is that Ricky became ill while out in the wilderness. Even a bad case of food poisoning, dehydration, or a sudden infection could be fatal if one is days away from civilization. We know from the evidence that he had a camp stove and pot, which indicates he was cooking for himself. Perhaps he ate something poisonous or drank untreated water that made him gravely sick. Alone and weak, he might have lain down in his sleeping bag and never woken up. The way his remains were found, at what looked like a campsite, undisturbed except by nature, suggests he perished peacefully in place, rather than in a panicked struggle. Some have wondered if Ricky might have intended to disappear, essentially choosing a hermit's life in the wild, before then ending it all. However, this theory doesn't appear to be supported by the evidence, and on the contrary, he had been exploring his future and had maintained contact until the point he vanished. Further yet, in my view, it doesn't really fit the evidence at the site where his body was located, so I think this one can very safely be ruled out. Also, naturally, since this is a national park disappearance, people have suggested a whole variety of really far-out, otherworldly theories about what could have happened. The evidence doesn't really support anything of this nature, though, so there's really not much more to say about that. And yeah, before you comment, I already know that someone will mention that he's a Midwestern guy with a vaguely German-sounding last name. At present, the true cause of Ricky Singer's passing isn't known, but police have continued to investigate the matter and have promised further updates. Personally, though, I suspect they'll rule that he perished from exposure and close out the file. Imagine hiking a tranquil trail in the Sierra Nevada foothills, only to stumble upon a decades-old secret hidden beneath the brush. In July 1984, a hiker near Nevada City, California, made a grim discovery: the remains of a young woman discarded down an embankment off a wooded trail. Nearly 40 years later, that woman is known only as the Nevada City Jane Doe, and both her identity and perpetrator remain unknown. On July 8, 1984, two hikers walking along the Independence Trail north of Nevada City noticed something disturbing. There, 200 feet down an embankment, they spotted something highly unusual, which turned out to be what was left of the body of a young woman. The woman's remains were almost entirely skeletonized by the time of discovery, indicating she had perished at least a few weeks prior. Authorities noted that the Jane Doe was Caucasian and likely between 18 and 30 years old, based on her bones and dental characteristics. Her height was harder to pin down due to the condition of the remains, but she was estimated somewhere between 5 feet and 5 feet 8 inches tall. She had shoulder-length hair that appeared to be dark blonde or light brown, remnants of which were found with the body. Even more alarming were the signs of what had happened to her. An autopsy later revealed that this woman had been slain in a particularly cruel way. Now I've got to give some details here because it'll be relevant to the analysis of the case and who may have done this. Without going into the gruesome details, she was strangled and also suffered significant blunt force trauma to her head. Based on the location, Investigators believe the actual attack took place elsewhere, and the predator dumped her body in this remote spot, hoping it would remain hidden. While the young woman had no identification on her, she was found with a number of personal items and clothing that offered critical clues. In fact, the clothing she wore was quite distinctive, both in style and in its inconsistency with the warm July weather. Detectives cataloged each item in hopes that someone might recognize them. She wore a distinctive red long-sleeved shirt with an embroidered tiger face on the front, layered under a large men's plaid shirt in red, tan, and blue. Over these, she had a tan reversible vest. Her lower body had size 8 Calvin Klein jeans, white tube socks with red stripes, and blue size 5 Nike sneakers. A red, tan, and blue bandana was tied around her right ankle, echoing the plaid shirt's colors. The only jewelry noted was a gold-toned floral ring with an oval opal stone at the center. The ensemble of clothing is striking for a couple of reasons. First, the layers of shirts and a vest were unusually heavy attire for a Northern California summer. July temperatures in Nevada City are hot, yet this woman was dressed as if for a cooler climate. Investigators took note of this and theorized that the victim may not have been a local resident, but perhaps came from a colder region. Secondly, the clothing and accessories themselves were potentially identifying. The embroidered tiger shirt was highly distinctive. Detectives publicly highlighted that shirt in particular, describing the tiger face design in media reports and circulating images of it. It wasn't a known band or sports team logo, but it looked unique enough that someone might recall seeing it before. And if you're watching this on YouTube right now, take a look at your screen and check out this unique tiger. I feel like this thing could actually be a core memory unlocked moment for someone who recalled a relative or a friend of the family wearing this exact shirt back in the day. Early efforts focused on standard police work of the 1980s, including manually checking missing persons reports and comparing dental records to national databases. Notably, due to the skeletonized nature of her remains, fingerprints, one of the most powerful forensic tools at the time, were unavailable. The autopsy estimated she'd been deceased for about a month, placing her time of death roughly in early to mid-June 1984. This timeline was important for investigators trying to match her to missing persons reports. They scoured recent reports of young women missing in late spring of that year. However, if this Jane Doe was from out of the area, her disappearance might not have been reported in Nevada County, and this significantly widened the scope of the search. One theory considered that she might have been a hitchhiker or traveler passing through. Highway 49, while not an interstate, is a route that connects to other major roads and tourist areas. While less common already than earlier years, it wouldn't be unheard of for a young person in the 1980s to hitch a ride, potentially crossing paths with the wrong person. The presence of a men's shirt in her layers could hint she acquired clothing along the way, or borrowed it from someone, perhaps a boyfriend, or even the perpetrator. There's also the possibility she was homeless, and that she was essentially carrying all her belongings on her back with her. These scenarios might explain why no immediate missing person match was found locally. If she wasn't from Nevada City and no one knew she was there, her disappearance might be logged in a completely different city or state, or potentially not reported at all. Over the years, numerous missing women have been compared to Nevada City's Jane Doe, but all have been ruled out. As for how to solve this is a case that's ripe to be solved with genetic genealogy, though it's unclear if her case has actually been referred out for testing. At any rate, if it hasn't been, if you're a local, consider reaching out to the authorities and asking for a status update on the case and if genetic genealogy has been considered. After all, the only way these does get their names back is if local people pressure their police departments to actually solve these cases. With her identity still elusive, there's also a number of theories about who committed this act. Notably, since this is an active and ongoing investigation, publicly released information has been somewhat limited. However, all that said, the nature of the crime provides some insights. Strangulation suggests a very personal and deliberate act, and the presence of blunt force trauma could indicate a struggle or an attempt to subdue her. It's possible the perpetrator knew the victim, but it could also be the work of a predator who picked up a vulnerable stranger. California in the 1980s had its share of violent serial offenders looking for individuals like this young woman to victimize. Notably, the I-5 strangler, Roger Kibbe, targeted women around Sacramento and Stockton, but his confirmed slayings began a couple of years after 1984. It's not impossible that the Nevada City Jane Doe was one of his early victims, though there's no evidence whatsoever to confirm this. As of now, the Nevada City Jane Doe remains unidentified for over 40 years, but the case is far from closed. Once her identity is returned to her by genetic genealogy, this may allow the police to reconstruct her last days and bring justice for her and her family. For now, though, her case remains a chilling, unsolved mystery from the California wilderness. It sounds like the stuff of legend. Two young children with green skin mysteriously appear in a medieval English village, speaking an unknown language and refusing to eat normal food. But this bizarre event was recorded by medieval chroniclers, notably the monk Ralph of Coggeshall and the historian William of Newburgh. The story of the Green Children of Woolpit blurs the line between folklore and history, and has people asking what exactly went down in this quiet English village nearly a millennia ago. During the mid-12th century harvest season in Woolpit, a village in Suffolk, England, local farmers made a startling discovery. They found two young siblings, a boy and a girl, near the wolf pits on the edge of the village. The children's skin was tinged green, their clothing was of an unfamiliar style, and they spoke in a language no one could recognize. The villagers were astonished and unsure what to do. By all accounts, the children themselves appeared bewildered and frightened by their new surroundings. Baffled, the villagers took the children in and presented them to Sir Richard de Calne, a local landowner. He tried to feed them, but the pair refused all ordinary food. The only thing they would eat were raw green beans straight from the pod, which they subsisted on for some time. With patient care, the strange pair began to adapt to their new surroundings. As they ate regular food, their greenish complexion faded away. Sadly, the boy fell ill and died not long after the children were baptized. The girl survived, learned English, and was given the name Agnes. She remained in the area for years, and some accounts claim she even married into the minor nobility. According to one account, she reportedly wed a man named Richard Barr, a respected English theologian who had studied in Italy. Agnes had, essentially, gone from a foundling with a strange appearance to being fully integrated into English society. When Agnes could finally communicate her story, while she was still a child, she revealed that she and her brother came from a place she called St. Martin's Land. In that country, she said, the sun never rose. It was always a land of dim twilight, and all the people there had green skin. One day, while tending their father's flock, the children heard a loud noise like church bells, and suddenly found themselves in the dazzling sunlight of another world, in a field at Woolpit. This fantastical account left her listeners baffled, with no clear answer as to where St. Martin's Land could actually be. Over the years, scholars and historians have sought rational explanations for the Woolpit mystery, examining it through the lens of history and science. Even in the Middle Ages, when even the most educated people were generally quite open to such supernatural events. The chroniclers who recorded it weren't sure how to handle it. One compelling modern interpretation is that the children were plain old human refugees, specifically descendants of Flemish immigrants who had settled in England. England in the mid-1100s was in turmoil during the anarchy, and things didn't get better for the Flemish immigrants after either. Flemish settlers who arrived in earlier decades found themselves caught up in the chaos. In the middle of the century, King Henry II expelled many Flemish migrants, leading some of them to take up an itinerant life or to seek survival by any means necessary. In 1173, at nearby Fornham St. Martin, not far from Woolpit, Flemish mercenaries in the service of an English lord ended up clashing with the English royal forces. These mercenaries were on the losing end of this battle, and the victorious crown forces turned the Flemish mercenaries over to the peasants of Fornham St. Martin. The mercenaries were not given lenient treatment, to say the least, with almost none of them surviving. Notably, whether all these Flemish mercenaries were from the continent, or whether some were drawn from the Flemish community in England, is unknown. This documented historical event has led to the theory that the Green children may have been orphaned survivors of this battle. Their father may have been a mercenary who was slain in the battle or the aftermath, while the fate of their mother isn't known. Perhaps their mother wasn't even alive, and their father was really the only one they had looking out for them. This could fit the theory of them being displaced Flemish children, or the children of Flemish economic migrants. They may simply have had very limited family in England. Their so-called gibberish speech under this theory would actually have been Flemish, unintelligible to the Suffolk villagers. Even the name St. Martin might be a clue. The presence of a local place named Fornham St. Martin could have influenced the girl's story of her homeland. Another key factor is the children's green skin, which likely has a scientific explanation. Medieval people used to refer to green sickness, a form of anemia caused by malnutrition, which can turn the skin a greenish-pale color. Malnourishment could have afflicted the children, especially if they had been surviving on a scant diet. Notably, their fixation on beans suggests they had little else to eat. Indeed, their green complexion reportedly disappeared after they started eating a normal, nourishing diet under care. This would make sense if they had been suffering from chronic malnutrition, known in modern terms as chlorosis. It's also possible that the children literally came through darkness into light. Perhaps they escaped through dense forests or spent time hiding out in caves, which later gave rise to their story of traveling via an underground world. Crucially, these explanations place the Green children in the context of known medieval events and conditions, without the supernatural. The era's civil strife and migrations could plausibly produce two lost children with a foreign tongue and unusual appearance. In this view, the Green children of Woolpit were simply orphaned outsiders whose circumstances were misunderstood by the villagers who found them. Another theory suggests that the fanciful descriptions given by Agnes of St. Martin's Land are the result of an active imagination. We don't know exactly how old the children were when they arrived at the village, nor do we know how old Agnes was when she gave her account of what happened to her and her brother. It's possible Agnes had simply filled in the memories unconsciously. Others have suggested she came up with a fanciful tale when she was a kid, which she then adapted into her autobiographical details as she became older. After all, Agnes herself would likely have wondered why she and her brother were green and why they spoke a foreign tongue upon arrival, and she likely needed answers for herself too. Not all interpretations are so down to earth. Some later writers imagined that the children truly came from a supernatural world beneath the earth, or that they were fairy folk who had strayed into the human realm. In the 17th century, one writer suggested that they had quite literally fallen from the sky, an early suggestion of an extraterrestrial origin for the tale. In modern times, a few authors have drawn parallels to alien little green men, suggesting that the kids weren't actually humans, but rather beings from the stars. Others believe the Woolpit story was simply a colorful medieval fable about encountering strangers, rather than a report of literal events. Indeed, apart from the chronicler's accounts, no official records corroborate the existence of the Green Children. However, that said, they arrived in a time of immense turmoil in medieval England, so the lack of proper documentation of their existence likely shouldn't be too shocking. Further yet, just because it doesn't exist now doesn't mean such documentation never existed. But the long and short of this theory of events is that it's essentially a medieval parable explaining how to treat outsiders with kindness. It's been speculated that if this is the case, this may actually be due to King Henry II's poor treatment of Flemish immigrants, who weren't treated with courtesy.